Great. So, hello and welcome to another event in the series of new media and contemporary culture. Today, I have an immense pleasure to have with me Dan Hassler-Forrest, an old colleague of mine from Utrecht. So Dan works as assistant professor of media and cultural studies at Utrecht University. He has published books and articles on superhero movies, comics, transmedia storytelling, critical theory, and zombies. He has recently completed 2 books on race and global media, focused on the creative work of performing artist Janelle Monáe. And his talk today, its title is Researching the Imagination Gap, Toxic Online Fandom, and the Dark Fantastic. Dan, thank you very much again. The floor is all yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Bart. Thank you for having me. Nice to, well, see your names anyway. I see the names of people. I don't see the actual people, but, which is
sorry, Dan, to interrupt. Yeah, I think for the reasons of, let's say, technicalities, let's keep people's presence for the time being to minimum, as just styles of names. And later I will ask all the audience to turn on the cameras for the Q&A session afterwards. I hope it's okay for you, Dan.
That's fine. That's fine. Then I'll it'll be a nice surprise to see what everybody looks like. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here virtually in or around Warsaw, I guess. I'm in the Netherlands right now, just outside of Utrecht, where I work, in my home office, as I guess we've all gotten used to. And I'm very happy to give a short talk on, I guess, some of the themes that I've been working with most recently. I have a whole bunch of slides. I think I've tried to time it a little bit to about 40 minutes, give or take. So we'll have some time in the hour left for questions, maybe a little bit more. You know, if we get excited, we'll see what we do. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen, and then if you have any like urgent comments along the way, I don't mind being interrupted. I mean, I love listening to the sound of my own voice, but honestly, a break is really pleasant. If somebody has something to interject or just a question of clarification, you know, you can butt in by raising your voice or a hand or something like that. Well, we'll see how it goes. We're always improvising. Anyway, I will share my screen. I have some videos in there, so we'll have a little bit of a break from my voice now and then. I guess it's a long title, I guess, but I guess it boils down to, well, maybe I better illustrate it with the next slide, which is this is just a couple of my books, or the ones that I've written. I've edited a bunch of others as well, but to give you a sense of what my background is and where I'm coming from. My first book was sort of developed out of my PhD project, and it was about. Or it is still, a book still exists, about superhero movies, which at the time that I wrote it, around 2012, I honestly had no idea that we would be entering a seemingly endless age of superhero hegemony in cinema. But here we are. And fortunately for me, I guess that means the book hasn't lost a lot of its relevance, even though obviously it's a little bit, you know, the references are a little bit old. But I wrote the book out of an interest in the relationship between the popular worlds and characters that we consume and inhabit and participate in, and the political environment that we inhabit in the real world, and how we see it both kind of reflected back to us, but also sometimes criticized and given interesting other directions. I wrote a book in Dutch, which I'll probably never do again, but I wanted to try it once, living in the Netherlands as I do, on transmedia storytelling. It's kind of an introduction, kind of a primer that I would use for students, even though it was, I think, more intended for students' parents. They could sort of give it to their parents, sort of give them a sense of like, what's going on? Well, this is what was going on. And I think my most sort of theoretically ambitious book, Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Politics, which is really about the, you know, at a more at a broader level about the sort of ambiguous relationship between capitalism and fantastic storytelling, specifically, in science fiction and fantasy genres. And so more recently, I wrote 2 books during COVID. I guess COVID had its advantages for me anyway, that I had a writing project to really hold on to through all the pandemonium while being locked inside. So I wrote. It's kind of cheating. I don't think they should really count as 2 books, even though they are physically 2 separate books. But the one on the right is the larger book that was really the main part of the project, about the work of Janelle Monáe and how to read her. For those of you who don't know her, she's I guess she's quite famous by now. She's a singer, artist, producer, and actor. Performing artist across media, I guess. I've always been interested in media as a kind of ecosystem. So thinking about media not so much as separate industries or platforms, but how both digitization on the one hand and neoliberalism on the other hand, globalization, have tended to suture them together somewhat. And even though the effects that this has had are mostly, I think, bad and depressing, as Disney basically, and a few large corporations now seem to own literally everything. And even, I was just reading how we're now on the cusp, apparently, of Elon Musk now buying Twitter out from under us. So we're living increasingly in a kind of oligarchical world. But that artists like Janelle Monáe, I think, are a really interesting and really inspiring and interesting example of how to navigate those systems in a more positive way. And so the other book is a shorter book, which is dedicated entirely to her transmedia project, Dirty Computer, which is an album and a film and a book and a couple of other things, I think. Mm-hmm. So I'm mentioning this not only to, shameless self-promotion for the stuff that I write, in the hopes that anybody will ever read it, but also to give you a sense of so I come from a background in sort of critical theory and political economy, looking at fandom and popular media, mostly from that perspective. But also seeing it very much as a form of participatory culture that has a kind of democratic, maybe even utopian potential, at least in it. And that more recently, I've been focusing much more strongly on how identity really plays into this. And specifically, I think how race and gender and sexuality, but I think most specifically race, has been one of the sort of grounding phenomena for how we experience media. And that's what I'll talk about today. So to begin with the classic, right, the first issue of The Amazing Spider-Man, early 1960s, I think it is 1960, where, I loved Spider-Man as a kid. He was my favorite superhero for a long time. Because I thought, mistakenly, I guess, that the appeal of Spider-Man was that he was universal, that anybody could be Spider-Man. I could be, of course, what I meant when I thought that was that I could be Spider-Man, but I'm not anybody. I was and remain a white boy, a white cisgendered boy. I guess I thought I was straight at the time. So, but anyway, a white boy can be Spider-Man. And that's a thing where I have a few clips in here, and I'll start with a clip from one of my favorite movies, which is a Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which introduces the character of Spider-Man to us. And I think it's interesting to look at how the movie does that, how the movie does it by, on the one hand, sort of acknowledging the fact that we're hyper-mediated, media-savvy viewers who already know this story and have heard it many times before. So it's really condensing a lot of different media platforms and media narratives and incarnations of Spider-Man into one very short, very intense movie scene. But it's also, I think, reproducing the same idea that is inherent in most incarnations of Spider-Man, is that he is an avatar, not for universality, but for white masculinity. So here we go with the opening scene from Into the Spider-Verse. Takes a few seconds, I think, to start up, but I have a spinning ball. Oh, should be going. There we go.
All right, let's do this one last time. My name is Peter Parker. I was bitten by a radioactive spider, and for 10 years, I've been the one and only Spider-Man. I'm pretty sure you know the rest.
With great power comes great responsibility.
I saved a bunch of people, fell in love, saved the city, And then I say the city again, and again, and again, and again. And I did this. We don't really talk about this. Look, I'm a comic book, I'm a serial, did a Christmas album, I have an excellent theme song, and a so-so popsicle. I mean, I've looked worse, but after everything, I still love being Spider-Man. I mean, who wouldn't? So no matter how many hits I take, I always find a way to come back. Because the only thing standing between this city and oblivion is me. There's only one Spider-Man. And you're looking at him.
There's only one Spider-Man. Of course, that is the whole joke of the movie in a way, that the idea that the Highlander mantra, I guess, there can be only one, doesn't really hold true the same way, that has gone into the more recent Spider-Man movie, No Way Home, which was last year's biggest hit and non-Oscar nominee, which Marvel fans got upset about. But of course, that had 3 different famous Spider-Men in it. But again, I think, if we read the opening scene about loving being, the fact that Peter Parker loves to be Spider-Man and there can only be one Spider-Man, what he's really obviously talking about is, if you're a white man, that is the role you were born to play, and that gives you access to any number of situations and systems of power. And I guess so thinking about what whiteness is particularly, and what gives whiteness its incredible symbolic, social, cultural, and hierarchical power. I guess Richard Dyer's book White is still probably the best work on that topic that I know of anyway. He wrote this book, I think, in 2007. Yeah, I think that's about right. So then this is the 20th anniversary edition that I'm quoting here. But it really leans into this idea that white people, that whiteness is really not initially about skin color. It's not about a particular kind of identity, but it's all about power, and that this power lies in what quoting here, the assumption that white people are simply people, that when you say people, you simply imagine a white person in the same way that you see Spider-Man, you imagine by default a white face inside of it, which is of course not far off saying that whites are people, whereas other colors are something else, right? Not quite people, has become endemic to white culture. And that's, I have a longer quote here from page 9, but it's worth I think following along. The equation of being white with being human always secures a position of power, right? The idea that whiteness is simply stands in for a number of things that we associate with the default definition of humanity. White people have power and believe that they think, feel, and act like and for all people, right? Like for myself as a white person, coming to realize that whiteness was not, that it had some kind of, actually I discovered the famous Australian blog Stuff White People Like, which made me sort of think about that differently, because again, the idea that I was one of those white people who didn't see skin color, who thought skin color doesn't matter because aren't we all just people? White people, of course, unable to see their own particularity, cannot take account of other people's. So it makes it harder for white people to understand that if you're not white, your experience of the world is really different, and that your particular background is always shaped to some extent by this racial hierarchy. That, thirdly, white people create the dominant images of the world, like Spider-Man, and don't quite see that they thus construct the world in their own image. So by making stories and characters that reflect our own identity and our own lived experience, we are creating hierarchies that make it, that by definition, put ourselves at the top. And that white people set standards of humanity, ultimately, by which they are bound to succeed and others bound to fail, right? So even though obviously not all white people have the same lived experience and not everybody has the same chances, and there are also things like class and gender and sexuality and many other things to take into account, whiteness is best understood as not so much, again, about what, about skin color, but about social power and how it is wielded. And so this book was published a couple of years ago, and instantly became one of my favorite books. It's written by Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. It's called The Dark Fantastic. And Ebony is a writer of fan fiction and young adult fiction, and spent a lot of time teaching not just college classrooms, but high schools as well, and teaching courses on creative writing, specifically fantastic fiction, and mostly working in schools with majority Black kids in them. And found, through that experience, that working with kids with Black children who love fantastic fiction, because who doesn't, right? Obviously, we all love that stuff, especially when you're a kid or a teenager. Being Black and engaging with these genres can be weird. It can be, and she wrote, and she did a lot of research into the background of fantastic fiction and how it relates to racial identity, and this book came out of that. And the title of the book, The Dark Fantastic, is a central term, obviously, throughout the book. It's the term that she uses for what she calls the role that racial difference plays in our fantastically storied imaginations, right? That while we may tend to imagine that fantastical story worlds like Narnia or Mordor, or Middle Earth or anything like that, that they're, that they have nothing to do with our physical world and the way that it's organized, that they're all imaginary creatures, but that all of them, wherever we go, we all find that race, in fact, plays a quite defining role. And, for myself, as somebody who grew up with Star Wars, I mean, it's really, really easy to see when you look at Star Wars how the different alien characters, aren't really speculative versions of potential alien life forms, which would be, probably quite weird and not very much like people, certainly wouldn't speak English, but that they're in fact kind of, offensive racial stereotypes. Of course, Jar Jar Binks, the most notorious one, but the anti-Semitic portrayal of, an old guy with a big nose who's grumpy and who won't spend any money, and Watto, or these guys who have these weird Asian accents and are supposedly kind of the Japanese negotiators. All of them speak to this kind of basic lack of imagination in terms of thinking about what otherness is. Or, to put it differently, simply equating racial otherness, non-whiteness, with being alien and weird, right? That's, I think, looking at Ewan McGregor standing there in the background as being as like the normal white man, but always having to deal with these weird creatures who are all coded versions of non-white people. Now, of course, there's also science fiction movies that take this to a more allegorical level to make it more specific. Movies like Enemy Mine and Alienation are really about, let's just say, also people, but the people are white, right? Having to learn how to deal with others and overcome their prejudice, right? So they're movies like Green Book or like Driving Miss Daisy, where a white person encounters somebody of a different ethnicity, which is presented within the film as being literally an alien, and has to learn. I mean, it sounds weird and crazy, but I think that is how this works in Hollywood logic. They have to learn painfully and slowly that even though they look different, they actually have a lot in common. But of course, the weird thing is that even in these, well-meaning movies that I think are supposed to be about how bad racism is, and that we shouldn't be racist. The weird mistake that they make, of course, is that even if you're saying that these aliens aren't as bad and monstrous as they look, you're still coding non-white people as being weird aliens with crazy shit on their face. I think an interesting example, counterexample, I guess, is The Brother from Another Planet, which is about an alien who arrives on Earth. But this alien happens to look exactly like a black person on Earth does, except he has weird feet. But when he's wearing shoes, nobody notices. And the joke of the film, or the concept of the film, is he lands by accident in Harlem, and so he finds that, like his own people, they're very much like him, and they're under constant oppression by the white police forces that are constantly patrolling the area. So there's a sort of interesting reversal of that in that one particular example. But all of these examples, I think, point to what Thomas calls, I love this term, this idea of the imagination gap, that there's, right, when it comes to race, we suffer from this gap that makes it extremely difficult to imagine any kind of sort of radical otherness without constantly resorting to processes of racialization. And I use the term racialization deliberately because it's really not, I think we have a tendency to think about race as being something that is essential, that is something that is like embedded within our DNA and that can be measured or phrenologized or something like that. Whereas racialization, I perceive it very much as a social process of looking at different groups like in the context of their economic, social, cultural, and class histories, and reading characteristics of them through that racial lens. And so her thesis, I guess, the thesis of her book, The Dark Fantastic, is that basically everything in our culture, as well as in modern history and contemporary life of the West, so it's not limited to fantastic fiction. It's just fantastic fiction is inherently connected to those things. It always demands the positioning of this figure of the dark other as an antagonist. Right? So in other words, when we look at our stories, but also our culture, they're always about, I say always, of course, you're going to think, well, what about this one? Yes, there are going to be exceptions that, I would say prove the rule. But overall, I would say that the logic dictates that that these stories are about whiteness coming under threat, and that the thing that threatens our precious whiteness is always some dark other that corrupts it. And this brings with it, this is, I think, an interesting way to look at storytelling and at media, and culture as something that gives us like an implicit colonial gaze, right? The idea that the world is kind of for white Europeans to conquer, and that anything else that we encounter within it that doesn't look exactly like us must be more primitive. This is, I think, the heritage of colonialism that we still have, that anything that is not exactly us, that's not like doesn't have our customs, our belief system, our technology, things like that, is less civilized, that they're not as advanced as we are, that they're developing countries where we are developed countries, that they're industrializing nations rather than industrialized, et cetera, and so forth. And one example, I think, just to illustrate this point, and maybe help to think about this not so much in terms of literal blackness, but thinking about how the colonial gaze really distorts what we see, is a clip I'll show from the movie The Avengers. The first, sorry, still doing the superhero thing, I guess, but the Avengers, I'm sure you know it, like it was the first team up movie in the Marvel cinematic universe, where the different superheroes that had been introduced in previous films, Captain America, Iron Man, et cetera, they're all white except for, I guess, the Hulk, right? Well, the joke, of course, is that the Hulk is definitely white, but that they end up waging this kind of weird restaging of 9/11, where New York City is attacked by evil invaders, who are, they look like people, at least they have heads and bodies and arms and stuff like that, but they're not actually people. They're more like insects, right? They're more like an infestation. And this means that while we see many different humanoid bodies on screen, some of them are disposable because they're not quite human and others aren't. So the superheroes that we see in action are free to affect violence on these other bodies because they're not seen as fully human. And of course, this is purely a colonialist logic. It's exactly the kind of logic that Europeans had when they came to the New World and found, Native Americans already living there, or wherever they came in the world. They said, well, even though they look like humans, they're not quite as good as us, so we can kill them. So I'll show this scene, and even that, it's a fun and exciting scene, but I think looking through that lens, it's just a little bit, it's a little bit off-putting, a little bit weird. Okay, here we go. Oh, sorry, I went too fast. I clicked too fast. I'll just go back there. Okay, here we go.
Captain, none of this is gonna mean a damn thing if we don't close that portal.
Our biggest guns couldn't touch it.
Oh, maybe it's not about guns.
If you want to get up there, you're gonna need a ride.
I got a ride. I could use a boost, though.
You sure about this?
Yeah, it's gonna be fun. Turn, left.
cool ending to a fun scene, but I think, it has so many of the elements that are recurring ways in which non-white people tend to be portrayed in white culture. Like if you notice these little things, it's very hard to distinguish individual, I think they're called the Cathauri, these aliens from each other, because they seem indistinct, right? They're more like a mass or a group. This is the way in which Black people have traditionally been drawn and thought of as represented as being this sort of undifferentiated mass, whereas the white heroes, of course, are incredibly distinct. They're very clear, not only in what they look like, but also what their personalities are, what they're good at. They all have skill sets that complement each other. The Cathauri, they look like humans, but they act, again, more like bugs, but also it's very hard to see where they begin and where their tools end, right? So they have these little rocket ships that they ride around that seem not like the kind of technology that we have. They seem more organic, like, again, more kind of primitive, and the same way that they are almost like extensions of tools, and therefore, again, they're less than human. There's a long list of things that we could go through, but I think that helps clarify how, again, films like these, they tend to constantly resurrect that distinction between whiteness and blackness. And even, I would say, again, even if some of the Avengers would be Black, which by now some of them are, the ways in which these battles are staged, if you look at the ending of Avengers Endgame, for instance, where you do have, the Black army from Wakanda fighting also against Thanos and his weird alien army, the same logic still holds, right? Because whiteness can integrate people of other people into it when it wants to. One of my favorite books is called How the Irish Became White. It's a history of Irishness in the United States, and how the Irish had to be differentiated from Black people, even though they occupied the same social ladder at the time, but they were allowed to ascend upwards and become socially mobile. Another book that I recommend very highly in this field is Speculative Blackness by Andre M. Carrington. There he is, lovely guy. The Future of Race in Science Fiction, where he writes about the whiteness of science fiction, right? And he says, like, science fiction as a genre that emerged in Europe almost exactly 200 years ago, right, alongside the development of industrial capitalism. He writes that the whiteness of science fiction names both the overrepresentation of white people among the ranks of science fiction authors. So if you look at the canon of science fiction authors, it's very hard to find any non-white authors until quite recently amongst that canon, and simultaneously the overrepresentation of white people's experiences within science fiction texts. So in science fiction texts, when it's very telling. Richard Pryor made this joke in the 1970s that when white people imagine the future, they tend to imagine it populated entirely with white people and in very white environments, like the inside of the ship in 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's like this clean white surfaces. Everything is sort of spick and span. Everything is uninfected. It's like this, like in the future, things will become whiter and whiter as we become more and more advanced, is one of the ways that, or even if we go into, a long ago, in a galaxy far, far away, I think like this poster is really telling when you start thinking about it through the lens of race. You go like, okay, so how many, like, we're going to a completely made up, fictional universe that's either in the past or in the future. We're not quite sure. It has elements of both. And we see this vast variety of people. Well, you can talk about gender and say, yes, there's one woman and the rest are all dudes, even the robots. But of course, they're also, again, the variety is not that diverse in the sense that they're obviously all white, except for, the towering, looming figure of Darth Vader, right? The blackest of black, right there in the background. And then when you sort of start thinking that through about this tension between, Luke and Darth Vader as one between, the corruption that we imagine is inherent in blackness, and that white people have to overcome this in themselves, that they have to overcome, their own dark side. And now the dark side, of course, is represented by not only by a thoroughly black figure, but one who's voiced by a black actor. And then the weird irony, I don't know if it's even irony, it's just crazy, becomes that, of course, when you watch the original trilogy of Star Wars movies, when he's finally redeemed, right, in the end, when he resists the dark side and is drawn back to the good, Darth Vader, he takes off his helmet and all of a sudden there's like the whitest dude ever inside. He's suddenly played by a completely different actor. It's like a literalization of the idea that whiteness is associated with pureness, with goodness, with all the things that we try to aspire to, whereas blackness is the depth that we have to fall. Thomas writes about this, about how a person of color, or even an imaginary, right, even a character, not even a real person, a character of color, can face dire consequences when they step outside their assigned place or flip the script in any way, right? When they try to resist this hold that the dark fantastic has over us. Essential qualities, she writes, such as goodness, beauty, innocence, and truth, have just been so often racialized as white in literature and media that ascribing these qualities to other groups is experienced by us as transgressive, right? That we kind of resist that. And that sounds terrible, right? That sounds like that can't possibly be true. It can't possibly be true that putting a Black person in a fantastic environment and making them the things that we associate with white would be difficult for us. But if you look at the evidence, it really is. And one of the things that she researched, that I did some work on as well, is the Hunger Games, right? How the Hunger Games is an adaptation of this series of trilogy of novels about Katniss Everdeen. Sorry, the names are terrible, but the books are kind of fun. Who's cast, in a big action movie, big blockbuster. And it's funny how in the book, like many fans pointed out, well, Katniss in the books is quite ethnically ambiguous. She could, she's the narrator of the book, so she's not described in a lot of detail because she doesn't, spend the story looking at herself and telling herself what she looks like. But she, at one point early in the first book, she remarks that her sister has straight black hair, olive skin, and that they have the same gray eyes. So she's explaining how they have, corresponding features. And then, of course, they did make her a brunette, but they did take just about the whitest actress in Hollywood right now and cast her in the film. And of course, her sister, who is supposed to be the even more innocent one, is totally blonde, right? Like the symbolism of having somebody who's young and innocent and cannot be sacrificed at any cost has to be a little white girl, the whitest, like literally the whitest white girl that we could find. But then the problem emerges, or a problem for a lot of viewers of the film when they cast the film, with the character of Rue. So Rue in the first novel and in the first movie is the sweetest kid that enters. I'm not going to explain the plot because I'm assuming people sort of know the Hunger Games, that either you've seen the movies or you kind of at least know about them. It's like Squid Game, but maybe a little bit, just a little bit different. In the movie, they cast a black actress to play the character of Rue, and Rue Rue dies. I'm sorry, that's a spoiler, but there she is. Rue dies. It's not much of a spoiler because the whole movie is about how everybody in it will die except for one person. Rue is described in the book as innocent, beautiful, pure at heart, all of the things that we associate traditionally with whiteness. And so having a black girl in the movie was something where, if you looked online and watched the sort of fans respond to this, was a very unpleasant kind of experience. At least it was, it's quite shocking to start collecting all the different tweets from people who, and I'm not even going into Reddit posts or 4chan stuff, just publicly available stuff on Facebook and Twitter about how shocked people were and how upset they were to find that one of their favorite characters, on whom they had, I think, just automatically seen as a kind of Elsa from Frozen, or the perfect embodiment of angelic, virginal, young femininity. To see her as a black girl is just something that for them destroyed the movie, right? Not because, and many of them say, not because I'm racist, I don't hate black people, but it just didn't feel right? And I think it's a very telling way in which I think Thomas's hypothesis, her basic thesis of her book about how this is really, how deeply embedded that is, and how far back it goes. And I think, for me, I grew up with Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit book and stuff like that. It's not moving. It should. Oh, there we go. Which obviously have the same tendency, right? Where the idea that Europeans come from an all white, all straight, innocent, pure agrarian environment, that this is the way we like to, imagine our past, being close to the earth, being, in touch with animals, smoking our weed, drinking our ale, just hanging out and being hobbits, that's a very convenient and pleasant way to imagine, European pre-modernity. But of course, it's kind of weird that when you then, if you start thinking about this and how the world of Tolkien works hierarchically, that again, it's the white people who are really the best and most beautiful people. That the whiter you are, the more beautiful you are, literally. I mean, the elves are the whitest people in the movies. And they're so white, they kind of glow in the dark if you look at them. And everybody who sees them falls in love with them. They live forever. They have the most beautiful songs. It's like diversity is forcing them out of this world. They're sort of passing on, unfortunately, and this is experienced by everybody as a terrible loss. Of course, the bad and ugly people in the movie are all dark. They're all from this place of literal darkness, of blackness and death and, all that stuff. Or they're coming from the Middle East with their turbans and their elephants, I mean, it's not exactly subtle when you look at the movie through that lens. And it's not, all of a sudden, it's maybe not that surprising that if you go online and you research memes, which I do quite a bit, you come to the kind of, upsetting conclusion that a lot of Nazis really, really like Tolkien, that they're really into this depiction, not because Tolkien was a Nazi. I mean, he wasn't. At best, I would say the works are kind of white supremacist adjacent, but that they draw on the symbolic power of associating blackness, and in particular black masculinity, with, again, this figure of the dark other, right? This figure that is both superhuman, like King Kong, like having a big and powerful body, but also subhuman in the sense that they're not as advanced, as civilized, as developed, as we are, and therefore they live, that we can use their bodies for sports or for labor or things like that, but they exist at a different level from actual humans. So some of our conclusions, right, are like that what this results in is that in our fantastic tradition, in our Western fantastic tradition, the dark other is always the spectacle, right? The monstrous thing that is ultimately the hero's root cause of hesitation, ambivalence, and the uncanny, right? It's a thing that they have to overcome. And therefore, reading, if you're reading these stories or watching them and you're not white, the implicit message that readers, hearers, and viewers of color receive as they read them is that we are the villains, right? We are the horde, we are the enemies, we are the monsters, even in genres that you really, that you're attached to, that you like to recognize yourself in. So obviously a lot of this is changing, right? And Thomas is not the only voice that is commenting about this. I think, there's a lot of discussion of wokeism and about political correctness or forced diversity or whatever weird words we want to call it. But in any case, media companies and producers of media texts and fandoms are very, we might even say obsessed with these issues. They're not just things that we talk about in universities. I mean, this is just the daily feed of Twitter is discussions about whether the Oscars are too white or, in what way race and gender are factoring into this. So if you look at something like the new Lord of the Rings production, which is a big Amazon Prime TV series or streaming series that's going to start in September. The Lord of the Rings of Power, I believe it's called. These are the first promotional images that were released just recently, just last month. And it's like, okay, it looks good. It looks kind of, looks a little bit tacky maybe, but so does the Lord of the Rings. I mean, honestly, but a lot of people got super upset about them, and not necessarily because they look cheesy and tacky, but because some of the good characters here, an elf, for instance, were not white, right? So a lot of Tolkien fans online went into an absolute flurry about this. This is, I just as part of research, I went online as just sort of look at, to sort of do an inventory of what the most popular comments were on the YouTube page where this video is hosted. And the most popular one by far, this is from several weeks ago when it had 24,000 thumbs up and 0 thumbs down, is this J.R. Tolkien quote, which is, let me just zoom in. Evil is not capable of creating anything new. It can only distort and destroy what has been invented or made by the forces of good, which on the surface doesn't seem like such a terrible response, right? It seems like, okay, it's just a generic thing about evil and good, and that evil doesn't create, but it only distorts things that are already there. But of course, it is, what it communicates to people within the fandom is that the world as Tolkien had made it was the thing that was good, right? And now it's being changed by evil, which cannot create something new itself. And by introducing ethnic diversity into the world of Tolkien in a positive way, or in a way that's not, just simply orcs being black. It's actually destroying, right? It's destroying something that's there. All of the comments, all of the top comments, as you go down the feed, are all that either a reproduction of this or a variation on it, or somebody saying with their own words a similar thing. A lot of it in Slavic languages, actually. If you go on Amazon Prime, where you can't like quotes. Oh no, you can't like quotes, but most people just simply put the same thing in Cyrillic over and over and over again. I went through many, many pages of it and never got to the end of that same quote. This is the same quote about evil not creating anything new, was just reproduced over and over and over again as a kind of, it's like white genocide. It's like a code word for racist readings that isn't instantly recognizable as being racist itself. This kind of backlash led to, triggered the people at Amazon to write a response for the popular magazine, The Wire, where they had their own diversity officers, people in charge of, keeping an eye on what kinds of things are produced and how they're related to questions of race and gender. They worked together with a couple of scholars working in adaptation studies to try to explain in this article that they published, like, well, adaptations are never like direct adaptations. They don't necessarily need to be judged by whether they're completely 100% faithful to the original. It's like a cultural process and a social process that reflects changes going on, that reflects rereadings and transitions from the text as well. And then, of course, this article had its own backlash amongst fans. This is just one of the many articles that was released. This is one of the worst, actually, sort of incel-driven websites on how the equality and diversity officers accuse Tolkien of Orientalism and applaud Amazon for removing white characters, where many of these kinds of images from the original films, some of which actually really seem to make the original author's point for them, the sense that whiteness is always representative of power and goodness and innocence, as in Sam, holding the white light of Galadriel to fend off dark evil, in this case, a monstrous spider, or of course, of the elephants from the east coming in. But they write that that not only do they accuse Tolkien of having outdated and unacceptable tropes, which I think, even the most conservative among us, even my dad, could agree that that was really, that yes, it's a little bit awkward. They also advocate for the removal of white characters purely based on their skin color. That's called racism. Well, I don't think that's most people's definition of racism. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. But it's an interesting kind of response to that speaks volumes, I think, about how this imagination gap really functions, right? How the imagination gap really is about an unwillingness to open up the way, or to connect the way that racialization really works in our social world to the way it works in our symbolic narrative world. So what to do, right? Well, to end on maybe a little bit more positive note, I think one thing that Thomas calls for in her book, and I hope this makes you excited to read the book, I really do, is what she calls a process of restorying, right? The sense that what our fantastic storytelling tradition is a kind of growing archive, and it's constantly developing. And it means that, the things that we grew up with, we can love and we can engage with them, but we can also, find new ways to tell those stories or to develop them in new directions. And that having things like, I guess, we don't know how it's going to turn out, but making those decisions to say, well, not all elves have to be white, right, is an important decision, especially for readers of color. And it's a thing where something like, the Black Panther, I'm going to skip this little video, but it's like the response that people tend to have with a movie like that, especially if you're not white, is to have this, sudden realization, this is what white people basically get all the time, right? These kinds of posters with people like them being the heroes that we look up to. And so I think, developments like, or sort of variations of science fiction like Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism is a kind of a way of, doing science fiction that rejects the biggest problems that are present throughout Western white science fiction, right? How it provides what H.L.T. Kwan calls an imaginary domain for radical democratic politics and life forms outside of white supremacy, racial capitalism, and heteropatriarchy. In other words, sort of imagining futures in which whiteness is not the default, and in which Black people are not automatically just sidekicks or secondary characters, or worse, right? Which often it's worse. And so she, like, I think it's my last quote from this wonderful book, but what she was, in an era of struggle and contestation over narrative meaning, what young people today are doing are reading and writing the self into existence, using fan communities and other digital affinity groups to restory the popular imagination by making it into their own image. And this is something that we see both within fan culture and fan activism and fan fiction, but also in big popular Hollywood movies. Increasingly, I think the success of these three films in particular, right? Black Panther, Get Out, and Creed, two of which are parts of ongoing franchises. So Creed is kind of a reboot or now a resurrection of the Rocky franchise, but shifting it over from a kind of proto-racist narrative of a white boxer being better than the version of Muhammad Ali that they put in the movie, in the original film, which was all about sort of white resentment of Black people's success at sports like boxing, but to put a Black person back in there and to not make it really, they don't even talk about race in the film in the way that in Get Out, it's a very, Get Out, of course, is not a franchise film, very much a genre film, but a genre film that sort of, that allegorically, or not even allegorically, that simply uses fantastic storytelling traditions to make racialization something that is palpable and understandable, especially that distinction between, or the sort of weird contradiction between Black people being considered simultaneously sub and superhuman. And to end kind of where we began, I want to end with Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which is another sort of way, I think, to restory familiar tropes for us. A film made by Black filmmakers, co-written and directed by a Black director, and in which the comic book character of Miles Morales was, of course, a Black comic book Spider-Man, becomes the new Spider-Man. And I think that one of those interesting things about the film is that, like Creed, it doesn't really talk about race, not literally, I mean, not explicitly. It's not talking about, you don't see Miles being the victim of racist abuse or anything like that. We don't see him, really feel like, or expressing to anybody else that, he feels different from other people. What we do see throughout the film is that he really struggles to have a sense that he is supported and that he fits in, that he's meant to do extraordinary things, which sets him quite far apart from Peter Parker, who always felt like he was sort of meant to do something great, but never had the ability to do it. And once he has it, it's like, boom, he's doing it and he's instantly good at it. For Miles, it's very different, right? And Miles has, for people who know the film, right, he has an uncle who's sort of vaguely, he's kind of shady, who's very much kind of, very culturally Black. He has the big speakers, he has music, and Miles really looks up to him because to him, he's an authentic representation of a particular kind of cultural identity that he sees as authentic to who he is and that he doesn't want to betray, right? Well, his father is also Black, but his father's a cop, right? So his father is embedded within a system of whiteness that he was trying to reject. And because he's a great student, he's being sent to this new school where there's diversity there, but it's a white school, right? Because the whiteness represents power and privilege. And so it's so interesting that in this film, we get not only Miles, but he needs like a whole cast of different spider people, right? Of different genders and different ethnicities and different ages and different classes, especially the Peter Parker from the other dimension who comes to help him, who's a Jewish Spider-Man, right? That he needs all of these allies to really actually be able to become the hero that the story wants him to be. And so I'll end with a little, so it's really a movie about allyship and how thinking about race and how to sort of move beyond, these kind of, this imagination gap is really not just a question of putting Black characters in white roles, but it's really about thinking about how do you tell stories that engage with questions of race in a productive way without, either being, without lecturing us about it, because nobody likes to be lectured about, like I've been doing for the past hour. Nobody likes to be lectured at, certainly not by a movie, right? And they don't have this kind of didactic element to them, right? To saying like, oh, racism is actually quite bad, which doesn't really work. But to have stories in which race really matters, but not, but in a almost subconscious way. Anyway, I'll show the final scene and then we can get to some questions here. This is the last scene, which of course mimics and kind of reflects the opening scene that I showed before.
Okay, let's do this one last time, yeah? For real this time. This is it. My name is Miles Morales. I was bitten by a radioactive spider, and for like 2 days, I've been the one and only Spider-Man. I think you know the rest. I finished my essay. I saved a bunch of people. Got hit by a drone. I did this with my dad. Met my roommate finally. Slapped a sticker where my dad's never gonna find it. And when I feel alone, like no one understands what I'm going through, I remember my friends who get it. I never thought I'd be able to do any of this stuff, but I can. Anyone can wear the mask. You could wear the mask. If you didn't know that before, I hope you do now. 'Cause I'm Spider-Man. And I'm not the only one. Not by a long shot.
Okay, I will resist mansplaining it even further, or dansplaining maybe, and I'll get out of the presentation and see what kinds of questions you guys have, if any. Maybe you just left it board, but anyway, here we are. I'm back in the screen.
Dan, thank you so very much. This was brilliant. I'm just going to stop recording.